Between their ownership of Whole Foods, a grocery delivery service, and the number of people buying essential goods online, Amazon's earnings have skyrocketed since the pandemic began. But Seattle Councilmember Kshama Sawant wants the corporation to share its wealth with local residents.
She proposed a tax on Amazon and the biggest 2% of businesses in Seattle. It would raise $500 million a year, with $200 million of this year's funding dedicated to the coronavirus relief for the city's workers. Councilmember Sawant, she joins us now via Skype to discuss this measure more. Councilmember, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So what is it about the current situation where you don't believe that Amazon is paying enough of its fair share to the city where it's headquartered? And what are the lack of resources that this type of money would be able to fill?
Well, let's step back from the pandemic. We're in the middle of the pandemic, but even before the pandemic, remember, this is the context of global capitalism. And this is Washington State, which is actually a blue state led by Democrats. Seattle is a very Democratic Party dominated city. And in that context, for years, for decades, what we've had is a state with the nation's most regressive tax system, meaning the poorest people pay the most. And if you're a wealthy household or a big corporation's executives, you pay little to nothing. And sometimes you pay a negative tax rate, meaning you get more back from the taxpayers of this state. And so corporations like Amazon, Boeing, Microsoft have enjoyed that corporate tax haven for decades. And for 3 years now, our movement here, led by socialists and workers and the labor movement, we've been fighting for what we call the Amazon tax, which is a tax on the biggest big businesses. Now, fast forward to this pandemic, things have gotten so much worse for the same people who are bearing the brunt of the capitalist system in the first place. And so we're seeing massive unemployment. You've covered all these issues on your show. Nationwide, there's an unemployment crisis and people are suffering. Many people who are at home don't have paychecks, even if they have not been actually laid off. And so it's high time that big businesses that are profiting, even in this pandemic, at least pay the bare minimum. I wouldn't actually even call this a fair deal. It is the bare minimum that we need to demand that corporations do. But it is going to take building a massive movement, because we're seeing corporations completely oppose even the small measures that they need to take in order to keep workers safe.
Mm-hmm. And Councilwoman, I suspect a number of our viewers have followed your efforts in the city to try to get Amazon to contribute their fair share here, and are probably following your efforts now. Just explain, where has that pushback come from? Because as you point out, it's a Democratic-dominated city, Democratic-dominated state. Seems like the supposed party of the people would be on board with something like this. So explain where the pushback comes from.
I think that's a very important point. In fact, that goes to the crux of the matter of why we are going to need working people, ordinary people, community members on the front lines in the tens of thousands if we are going to win this. Because as you said, this is a Democratic dominated city, and there is no question that there is a difference between Republicans and Democrats. There is certainly a difference between the Trump administration and the Democratic Party. But the one thing that they absolutely agree on, the Democratic establishment and the Republican Party, the one thing they absolutely agree on is their ironclad loyalty to Wall Street interests and to big business. And that is why, even though you have a city council here in Seattle, which is 8 Democrats and 1 socialist, you still are going to require a mass movement from below. Just to give you some context, 2 years ago in 2018, our movement was strong enough to force the city council to pass unanimously an Amazon tax at that time. But less than a month after that unanimous vote, 7 of the 9 council members, they're all Democrats, they all repealed that tax in a backroom deal that they did with Amazon lobbyists and corporate Mayor Durkin. So at the end of the day, if we are to break the stranglehold of the super wealthy, of big business on politics, then we are going to need independent politics. And that is why we've shown how even with 1 socialist on the city council, you can make a remarkable and historic difference. We won the $15 minimum wage in Seattle on the basis of socialist politics and workers fighting back. That's what we're going to need for the Amazon tax. That's what we're going to need to win gains for workers in the middle of this pandemic as well.
Mm-hmm. And Councilwoman, I think we should be clear. Your tax is applying to also not just Amazon, but all of these massive corporations that are headquartered in Washington State, Microsoft, Boeing, and so many of these. And so just describe like what this friendly tax environment, have these companies used the money that they're saving to invest in Washington State? What is it that they've been doing with this windfall?
With the windfall that these corporations have gotten, what has happened is workers' incomes have stagnated, their tax rates have gone up, and in fact, the basics that we have somehow held afloat, like public education, public health, affordable housing, most of that is funded through regressive taxes, as I said, on workers, and also property taxes, which is also a regressive tax in Washington State. It's not like it's a mansion tax where the wealthiest pay the most, but ordinary middle class and working class homeowners for whom their homes are their only equity, they are the ones who shoulder the biggest burden of the taxes. So what do these corporations who have had a tax haven do? Well, you've seen Boeing that has carried out a decade after decade of highway robbery on this state. In 2013, just a few days after I was elected in a major upset, defeating a 16-year Democratic powerful incumbent, just a few days after that, I was at a rainy winter day rally with Boeing workers who were absolutely infuriated because they had been sold out by the Democratic governor and the Democratic-led state legislature, giving the Boeing executives a $8.7 billion corporate handout, which even today is the single largest corporate handout in US history. And at that time, that deal was given to Boeing by the Democratic governor, who is still the governor, Jay Inslee, because the whole fear was if you don't give Boeing executives what they ask for, then, oh my God, that they're going to take the jobs away. And do you know what happened after that deal was given to Boeing executives? They took 13,000 jobs away from this state. So really, the story of this kind of politics of allowing corporations to extort year after year from working people, the story of allowing ourselves to accept a rotten deal from the Democratic establishment is the story of the race to the bottom nationwide, because we are all afraid that our jobs are going to go away from Washington State to South Carolina. Let's give Boeing everything that they need. But in the meanwhile, we are all, as working people, we are all slipping downwards while the biggest corporations and the billionaires continue to rake it in. I might just say, in terms of what is Amazon doing with the profits that it is making during the pandemic, they are Amazon and its contracting companies are intimidating workers all the way from Seattle to Staten Island. On Staten Island, in the big warehouse there, Amazon just fired Chris Smalls, a worker who was courageously fighting and led a walkout against the fact that the workers are being exposed to coronavirus. Here in Seattle, at the delivery stations, workers are being intimidated at the contracting companies as well. So this is what corporations are doing, and I would just add that these are concrete examples of why we should realize that capitalism can never be reformed, because even when it's about small things like hazard pay or clean the warehouse or make sure that you pay your fair share of taxes, even when it's about small things like that, corporations and the wealthy go tooth and nail to war against even these small things. So how is it going to be possible to win a different kind of society on the basis of this kind of system?
Something that we've followed really closely here. I mean, just as I'm listening to you talk, my family has roots in West Virginia, and I've done some work there. And it's the classic company town. I mean, it's the modern version of like the coal towns, where everything is structured around the coal companies and their extraction and what they want. And you're damned if you do, and you're damned if you don't, because of course people need the income, right? And they need the jobs. And so elected leaders do everything they can to keep the company happy and give them everything that they need. But on the other side of it is workers who have no power, and a system that's based on essentially extraction, and over time isn't additive to the local community at all. Because at the same time, people are listening to you talk, they're saying, well, geez, we wish we had Amazon here so that we could have those jobs. But you can see how it's essentially a Faustian bargain for everyone.
Absolutely, and we have to one of the most fundamental lessons that workers can learn through the experience of the pandemic, that is we don't have to accept that false choice, as you were describing, where some of us can have jobs, and these are not great jobs. Most of us are living paycheck to paycheck, literally hand to mouth. The majority of workers are living in the richest country in the history of humanity. So it's not even much that we get in return for all the subjugation that we put on ourselves. We accept that, okay, some of us can have jobs. We're always going to have unemployment under capitalism. In the economics textbooks, full unemployment is described as 4 to 5% unemployment rate. It's bizarre. I mean, anybody who's thinking with a rational framework in their minds should reject the whole premise of capitalism as completely ludicrous. I mean, how is it possible that we can defend an economy which is collapsing because workers need to be safe? I mean, it's the whole point about Trump and the politicians saying workers need to go back to work, even if they're going to actually literally die. That is not an economy that we can accept. It is possible to have a different kind of economy, a socialist economy, where workers are doing essential work, people have vacation time, people have paid sick leave, and we are actually behaving as a society, not with with a world that is deeply divided between the upper class, the ruling class, the capitalists, and the rest of us, and the planet's life at stake.
Councilwoman Sawant.
Councilwoman, thank you.
Thank you so much. So great to have you today. Keep fighting.
Thank you so much. Likewise.
And we'll have more Rising for you after this.